Welcome to Frontlines. We'll give everybody a few moments to do their shares and watch parties before we get started with this evening's guest. We'd like to welcome our viewers from across the United States and Canada, throughout Europe and the Middle East, and of course, Armenia and Artsakh. It has been exactly 5 months since the signing of the trilateral statement, and it is 2.5 months until the June 20th parliamentary elections. Armenia, Artsakh, and even the diaspora institutions themselves stand at a crossroads. Many say potentially an existential one. Today, we're going to get into politics. We're going to get into the military. We're going to get into national security. And with that, I'd like to pass it on to Garo to introduce our guest today.
Thank you, Karnig. Good evening, everyone in the continental United States and Northern America and elsewhere. Good morning in Yerevan and Stepanakert, and good day everywhere else. We are very fortunate to have with us Professor Nerses Kopaylan from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who is joining us today and taking away from his, what would be the end of a Sunday evening in the Western United States. Nerses Kopaylan is a professor, as I said. He's a PhD and an assistant professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His fields of specialization include international relations, political theory, and philosophy of science. He has conducted extensive research on analytic philosophy, feminist theory, and paradigm building. He is the co-author of Sex, Power, and Politics, Palgrave Macmillan in 2016 published. He is also the author of World Political Systems After Polarity, Routledge 2017. His current research concentrates on political violence and terrorism and its impact on geopolitical and great power relations. Most importantly for us, he has just recently, very recently, returned from our ancestral homeland, our beloved Armenia. So I'd like everyone to give a virtual warm Frontlines welcome to our expert in international relations, superpowers and polarity studies, theories of international relations, international security, and terrorism, and all things Caucasus and Eurasia. Professor Kopaylan, I am pleased to have you join us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Professor, I have to say, I know there's a lot of different subject matter that we're going to dive into today, and some of it's going to be, somewhat surprising perhaps to a lot of our viewers. We're going to be speaking at some length about the IRI survey that you're familiar with and have spoken about and analyzed before. But before getting into that, I'd like to kind of start in almost chronologically kind of how we got here. And I want to kind of delve into a few military, national security questions. And the reason for that is you're one of the few people that has really been a student of the Armenian military for a number of years. And I think that background is very, very unique. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'll ask it right now, but I'm going to give a little bit of background and context to it. My question is going to be, what are the Russians doing with the Armenian army? Number one. And second is, what is the trade-off? But before I ask you to answer those questions, I want to put some context in. When we saw what the Russian army looked like in the Georgian War in 2008 versus what it looked like in 2014 in Crimea, we saw a huge difference. One of the issues with the Armenian military, which you've spoken about, are issues with security architecture, defense infrastructure, and things of that nature. My guess is that there is some benefit to structuring an architecture from the defense standpoint. I think many Armenians were shocked to see the sheer amount and organization of the 2020 deployment of the Russians in Karabakh. I know I was when I was watching things happen. So with that said, can you give us a little bit of background, perhaps even how we got here in terms of the state of the Armenian military in the years leading up to the conflict? And I would consider one of the most important questions moving forward, what are the Russians doing with the Armenian army, and what is the trade-off?
Of course, these are very, very important questions. So after the first Karabakh War, or the first Artsakh War, Armenia styled itself as the most powerful military in the Southern Caucasus. And that became the narrative for the last 30 years. Initially, this was a very consistent assessment. Azerbaijan's army was defeated, very depleted, and Georgia was basically recovering from its civil wars between Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So Armenia stood out as a sort of a victorious, powerful army in the region. This narrative sustained itself for the next 30 years. However, between the narrative and actual substance, there was a deficiency. Whereas Georgia continued, for example, to develop in the Southern Caucasus through US aid and through NATO coordination after the Rose Revolution, and Azerbaijan utilized its immense oil resources to purchase advanced weaponry to rebuild their army and further integrate their strategic planning with Turkey, we remained relatively stagnant. And so while we maintained the narrative having the most powerful force in the Southern Caucasus, that substantively speaking was not really the case. So we had four main deficiencies that became very clear and prevalent, not only in the 2020 war, but we actually saw this in the 4-day war in 2016, in April of 2016 when it happened. One, we realized that we had a severe chain of command problem. Those of us who went to Artsakh after 2016 and did basic research and interacted, we realized that while our army is relatively professionalized, and the term relative is very important here, we still had a lot of sort of personalized elements in the armed forces. We had a lot of non-institutionalized elements in the personal interactions between commanders and sort of military leaders in the echelons and chain of command. So this was one issue we had. The second was the very obvious one. We had serious logistical problems as well. You know, and of course, logistical issues are connected to the third problem, which is corruption. When we had deficiencies, for example, in oil or gasoline, whatever, being delivered to the front lines, or ammunition, or whatever necessary thing, consignments, things of that sort, that also harms the war effort. And the fourth, more important one, is that we realized that our military doctrines are outdated. 2014 was very clear on this. Right. In 4 days, we lost about 120 soldiers. Okay. We lost 8 hectares of territory. We lost very important strategic positions such as Lele Tepe. And the whole discussion was, especially those like me, who went back there, we were like, okay, why didn't we do a counteroffensive? Why didn't we take these territories back? And if we realized for 2020, that was the same question we all kept posing. When is a counteroffensive happening? What's going on? Because for 30 years, we've been told we have the most powerful military in the South Caucasus. So all of us were posing the question, okay, when is this powerful army going to act? But in 2016, when I spoke with several generals and people in military positions, especially in strategic planning, they were not able to give me an answer as to why we did not go on a counteroffensive. And 2020 made it clear. Because we didn't have the resources, we couldn't. And that's the honest answer. So the 4 deficiencies, and these are very sort of macro, broad deficiencies that I'm speaking of. There's a lot of sort of nuances there that were very prevalent in 2016, became more than clear in the 44 days of war that we saw in 2020. And you can't win a war with a deficient security architecture. You can't win a war where there's a flaw in the chain of command. You can't win a war when you have logistical issues, and you can't win a war when the so-called 5th generation of war that everybody was talking about, which was unfairly perpetrated against Armenia through Azerbaijan and Turkish command, where our military doctrine was at best 4-generational. So all these deficiencies explain the structural flaws that we had and the need for institutional reforms. And so this is the question that kind of ties in with yours. Can we do our institutional reforms on our own, or really do we need Russia? What many don't realize is that Russia has been part of Armenia's security architecture since 1994. This isn't anything new. What we had claimed is that we could take care of the Artsakh problem without Russia. This obviously didn't happen. This wasn't the case. And Russia made it clear for the longest time that they would not get involved if war broke out in thing. So war broke out, we had the complications, we had the serious losses that we had, and Russia stepped in after the ceasefire, trilateral ceasefire agreement. Now, Russia's role in Armenia has not really changed militarily because our alliance structure remains the same. But on the ground, what we're seeing are a couple of developments. One, we're seeing a further integration of Armenia's air force. Russia's playing a bigger role, a more active role, such as their Belladonna anti-aircraft, anti-drone technology that we're importing and utilizing some of this advanced thing, or relatively advanced technology. A second thing that we're seeing is the development of small military camps or posts throughout the Sunni region. Russia is basically strategically placing these posts to kind of give Armenia that sense of guarantee, security that, we are going to fulfill our security guarantees to the Republic of Armenia, and that's what we're doing. We're securing your borders because they've been securing the Gyumri border forever, and now they're in the Sunni region as well. And the third factor that we're seeing is, and this has been a lot of talk between Armenia's Minister of Defense, Karnig, and Shoigu, Russia's Ministry of Defense, on actually implementing institutional reforms or military reforms. The extent to which these reforms will be sufficient is quite early to say, but we know that it is in process. And so what Russia basically is doing are those things. What Russia gains from this is what Russia has wanted since 1994, to have troops on the ground in Artsakh. This is it's not even no secret. It's been part of every peace plan that Russia has offered since 1994. And this is a sort of, their position. And so Russia's number one objective right now is to secure stability and to secure the peace so that it could maintain its peacekeeping force in Artsakh for its geostrategic interests. So that's kind
Karnig,
of the general things.
Karnig, if I may, since we're talking about the Army, according to the Center for Insights and Survey Research, that detailed methodology whereby in a period of a week in February, between, I believe, 8th and the 16th of February, there was a survey conducted by this International Republican Institute, if you will, IRI. And when you take a close look at that survey, some things are very, very puzzling to a lot of people, certainly to me. One of them, I understand more than the others, and that is the approval rating, if you will, of the Army. The Army is the #1 rated institution in that survey. And this is, of course, despite the loss of, what, for lack of a better word, is a war, because I don't think it was a war. It was a carnage of sorts, a battle of very unequal forces, if you will. To me, it's a very illuminating revelation of people's mindset. What is, in your opinion, Professor Kopaylan, that support due to? You just came back from there. What can you add to that equation?
That's a very good question, Garo. So the Army support right now, the favorability rating with the recent IRI survey is about 73%. In the IRI survey that was released in May of 2019, if I recall, it was in the high 80, 90 percentile. So we have seen
the previous one, yes.
So we have seen some drop, but we have to consider a few things. One, in Armenia's political culture, the Army is sacred, and sacredness is not wiped out through a single war. Second, Armenian society does not equate the Army with its generals or the institution. It equates it with its soldiers. And since mostly everybody's sons and some of their daughters are part of the Army, that sort of perception is inherently there. And so that militarized culture, that adoration of the military and that political culture explains why the military still has very, very high ratings. But if this question, for example, was posed, your approval rating of the military leadership, for example, or the generals, you would very likely see a very different response. So the answer to your question then is, I think Armenia's political culture separates the sort of the administrative leadership from these soldiers. They identify the army with the basic soldier. And that's why the ratings remain relatively high.
Do you think that in the context of, and this is the only area of the survey that I really understand the reasoning behind it, which is, you put it very well, the army is sacred. Our freedom fighters over centuries have been sacred to us because they have been the preservers of our identity and our existence and perseverance. Do you think, as a political scientist, that the politicization that took place the last couple of months, where there were calls between from the 17 opposition parties that the army should take over the government, do you think that was wise? Because I'm not a political scientist. I always have advocated, whenever people have decided to criticize the army or split hairs when it comes to the Armenian army, that they ought to leave it alone, not politicize it at all. But what's the sense of a political scientist such as yourself? What's the sense of the people, since you just returned from there?
Yeah. So criticizing the army for its institutional flaws is one thing. But demanding the army to take over the political system, that obviously is problematic, because Armenia's constitution specifically demands civilian control over the military. You can't have a democracy with the military junta or any other structuration.
Right.
Also, Armenia's military is not designed to function domestically. What most people don't realize is that Armenia does not have a volunteer military force. It's conscript. Okay. So most conscripts are there to serve their 2 years and to go back home. Whereas in advanced volunteer democratic or non-democratic military political systems, where the military force is voluntary, we have soldiers who are trained to be killers. You have soldiers who are trained to follow orders. The Armenian soldier who's a conscript who's serving there for 2 years, he's not trained to engage in domestic control, to be moved into the streets, to engage in takeover of buildings, so on and so forth. These are sort of simple anecdotal examples that I'm giving, but Armenia's military is not designed for domestic control. So that's one component. Second, the military leadership itself has no intentions, or did not have any intentions of a military takeover. All they requested was the prime minister's resignation, not the prime minister's resignation and a military takeover. Now, of course, that request in of itself was inherently problematic because it did violate the civilian military document that is stipulated in Armenia's constitution. And this is why it created a lot of concerns. But it obviously did not resonate with Armenian society. The society did not side with the military leadership. And this goes back to our point that Armenian society did not equate only Ghazarian, the chief of staff and the military elite, with the army. That's why they never said the army is demanding the prime minister's resignation. The whole discourse was 40 military leaders or 40 military personnel. So I think that distinction is very, very important. But in any context we look at, there has never been any serious consideration of a military takeover. What the opposition was hoping before the opposition collapsed several weeks back with Barkova, Chayastan, Prosperous Armenia leaving the group of 17 prior to their collapse, what the opposition, the group of 17, was hoping is that sufficient military pressure might lead to Pashinyan's resignation. So that was all. There was never no serious discussion about a military takeover.
Karnig, thank you.
Yeah, Professor, I think that, and I'm not as much a student of history as perhaps I'd like to be. But I do know that the circumstances of the survival of the Pashinyan government post what he had himself termed an existential war, a loss in an existential war, is likely one of, in political science, somewhat unique if you look at it only with those parameters. I'd like you to kind of dig in a little bit and tell us, what the IRI study shows is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my quick read of some of the relevant surveys shows that he's lost some support, but he remains overwhelmingly popular, and that the opposition itself lacks trust and credibility. I mean, those are pretty two important themes, which I found relatively eye-opening, especially in the, from an international relations aspect, when, your leadership is at the helm, when you lose the biggest prize of the Republic, and you're still there. What are the underlying currents that are making that possible? And do you think that that is something that will carry on all the way to June?
Great question. Few assessments here. One, democratic politics speaks volumes for this, because this inherently is a legitimate government that represents the will of the people by virtue of the 2018 elections. Democratic elections have consequences, and one of those consequences is legitimacy. So when a legitimately elected government in power suffers defeats or complexities, the public that voted for that government is really not so quick to demand its demise, because it was their vote, their will, that put them into position. So democratic electoral politics is one explanatory aspect of this. The second is we do have some precedent for this, actually. In 2008, for example, right, during the Georgia-Russia war, Georgia was embarrassingly defeated. Russia was almost at the fringe of walking to Tbilisi. But Saakashvili's government did not collapse because he was democratically elected. He had the same legitimacy. We saw also something similar in Ukraine. When Poroshenko's government started suffering defeats in the Donbass region, his government did not collapse because he was democratically elected. So I think, a democratically elected government has a lot more leeway when it comes to suffering losses, because the people view the legitimacy that they have to be important, in the sense that that government has sufficient amount of political capital. And if we know anything about Armenia's political system or its politics, Pashinyan has quite a bit of political capital. But that political capital has diminished from the high 70 percentile to the mid 50 percentile with the recent survey. So there's been that important change. And the third explanatory factor here is, as you kind of touched up on, the lack of a legitimate or credible opposition. If Armenia was an established parliamentary democracy with a legitimate opposition, this government would have resigned a long time ago. Okay, many people sort of gave the example of, look at the UK. Theresa May resigned because of X, Y, and Z, or David Cameron resigned because of X, Y, and Z. Because they're a developed democracy, when your government fails, you're removed, and a new government is replaced by parliament. Or you have snap elections, and you have a very powerful opposition, legitimate opposition, and they participate, and people have a voice. In Armenia, you do not have a credible opposition. As this IRI survey shows, if we look at the numbers of the collective opposition so far, they collectively garner barely 10%, and this includes every opposition party. That inherently is problematic. So I think people have, relatively speaking, more trust towards this government with all its flaws in relation to whatever the opposition represents. And another important thing to consider, and we could maybe come back to this later on, is that the Velvet Revolution brought about a certain notion of institutional trust in Armenia. Whereas in the past, citizens had very little trust in the system and the government. Imagine a government that committed the #1 political sin in Armenia's political culture, and that is losing territory, right? They lost a lot of territory in Artsakh. Even after committing that political sin, the people are still willing, at least a very large majority of the people are still willing to give this government some leeway. So that suggests a level of institutional trust that's developed. So all those factors kind of intertwine and explain why the office of the prime minister enjoys 54-55% favorability ratings, even after all the deficiencies we speak of.
And Professor, I want to follow up on that, if I may, just real quickly, because the other thing that shocked me, quite frankly, is where the Artsakh issue was among the voting population, or at least the surveyed population, in terms of its hierarchy of importance. #1 was economic issues. And if I'm not mistaken, Artsakh was 4th on the list.
Correct.
And the reason I want to bring that bit of the survey up, because I want to lead it into my next question. Isn't there a national security failure that the war exposed, whether it's institutional or political or diplomatic? There was a national security issue disclosed. Does the population that puts Artsakh at the bottom, or not at the top, let's be honest, of that list, is it that national security is, I mean, there's different ways to interpret that, but one of them is to say, the bread on my table is more important than Artsakh. That could be a real interpretation of what that part of the survey says. Another one could be that they're relying on regional security arrangements and they have confidence in the role of Russia, and national security and Artsakh may not be that high on the list. The fact that Artsakh was below, and I can't remember the other two on the survey, but economic participation or economic opportunities was ranked the highest, and the survey ranked fourth. The value of the Artsakh issue, it almost feels as if it's whiplash from September 26th to today, because I don't imagine that necessarily was the case. I mean, maybe it was underlying. I don't know what the previous survey showed, but I have to say, I was floored by that, Professor. And could you explain, where you think those numbers come from and what that means?
Sure, of course. So I don't think it's a national security issue, and I'll explain that in a second. And actually, the survey kind of clarifies that. There's a couple of explanations why the Artsakh issue is fourth. One, usually you have a post-traumatic issue where society is traumatized, so they don't really want to deal with the war at this stage. The Karabakh issue, the Artsakh issue for Armenian society is very traumatic. So that issue is not prioritized in relation to the other top issues on that poll, which were economic growth or economic concerns, political stability. Third was military reforms, and then fourth was Artsakh. But to answer your question, the fact that military reforms is ranked third, I think that suggests that there is a national security concern that society wants addressed, because we've never had military reforms so high up. Matter of fact, military reforms were never an issue. So the fact that military reforms ranked third, I think that citizens are concerned about national security. They just don't equate that with the current developments in Artsakh, because you have the Russian peacekeepers. And so they view the Russian presence as a sufficient security. But whenever we talk about, Tavush, whenever we talk about Nakhichevan, then you do realize that these are security issues. How do you fix that? You make the army stronger. This is why military reforms rank number 3, and political stability ranked number 2. And everybody knows that this political instability is a byproduct of the war. So it's all kind of interconnected. So if we look at Artsakh being number 4, if you look at that in a vacuum, you'd be like, it's shocking. But when you consider military reforms and political stability, and we see how that's all interconnected, I don't think Armenian society is indifferent to the Artsakh issue. I think they view the Artsakh issue as, at this point, being relatively resolved because Russia is there and we can't do much about it. And if you looked at the survey where there was a question about, what is your position of the ceasefire, vast majority agreed with the implementation of the ceasefire, maybe renegotiating some of the ceasefire, but only a quarter said, let's rip out the ceasefire and go back to war. So nobody's really seriously considering about reinitiating conflict. What the poll suggests is people want economic growth, political stability, strong army, and then we could deal with the Artsakh issue.
Since we're talking about the poll, I'm going to throw a few things out at you, Professor. Corruption is number 18 on that poll in terms of what's important, according to those who were polled. Poverty, number 17. Wages, number 16. in terms of priority. Migration, number 15 on the list. Education, number 12. National security of Armenia, standalone concern, number 11. Territorial border issues, despite the fact that just before we got on the air, I spoke to a friend of mine in Armenia who said that he doesn't go to Syunik the way he used to go to Syunik. He's a local from Syunik. He goes to Syunik from Yerevan a different way now because of security concerns he has. Physical security military attack in terms of importance is number 7. Here's the shocker. Return of captives and missing persons, number 6 on the list. Number 6 on the list, while we keep hearing, quote unquote, it's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, stupid. Let's open the borders. Let's build the railroad. And let's have trade. And let's just all make a lot of money. How do you think, as a political scientist, those opposing views can be reconciled, given the fact that, you know, you're surrounded by 100 million people whose governments, let's not talk about the radicals within, let's not individualize them, whose governments have been on a campaign of exterminate the Armenians, you know, in various forms of utterances, if you will. How do you reconcile this? This is a disturbing poll to me. I'll return to the poll later after I give you a chance to respond, and Karnig can comment further. Thank you.
That's an excellent question, Garo. One point I would make is that there's a different political culture in the diaspora and a different political culture in Armenia. The same existential threat issues that the diaspora perceives by virtue of the legacy of the genocide and so on and so forth are not the same way that Armenian society perceives these existential issues. So whereas, let's say, those of us in the diaspora view Turkey as an existential threat, the Armenian citizen, until this war, never viewed Turkey as an existential threat. So these are recently developing dynamics that are still have not sunk into society. That's one important point I would make. As far as your references to the poll, these are very good points. Corruption is ranked very low because to a very large extent, systemic corruption has been alleviated. Systemic corruption. But of course, elements of corruption do exist. But the Armenian citizen is no longer worried about corruption basically inhibiting their lives or their role in society. So that's one aspect of it. Poverty is also a very important, interesting indicator. There has been some economic growth through years, obviously, but there's two ways of looking at it. One, society might have gotten so desensitized that they don't care about poverty anymore. Poor people are just used to being poor, hypothetically speaking. So poverty, citizens, if you ask them, what's the big important, more important concern for you? When they say economics, for them, poverty is kind of lumped into that. So separating it might have been a disconnect in the questioning. But the sixth issue, right, return of the POWs, or what I call hostages, is a different issue because in February, when this poll was conducted, this was not a very big issue because we thought sooner or later, today or tomorrow, this issue is going to be resolved. If the same poll is conducted today, and I think IRA is supposed to have one released in April, actually, I guarantee you the POW issue is going to be ranked much higher. So I think this is more of a timing thing that explains it. But I fundamentally agree with you. The POW issue is a serious problem that we're not able to find a solution to. The government is very, in essence, impotent on this issue. They're limited in their capabilities. There's a lot of reliance on Russia. I don't think the Kremlin is ready to use its political capital with Baku just on this issue. There's some give and take. And sadly, Aliyev holds all the cards on this, or vast majority of it. So the one venue we do have is diplomatic pressure. Armenia does not have the diplomatic capabilities at this point. So the other leverage is to the diaspora to utilize all its resources to put as much pressure as it can in the different communities throughout the world that we live in for the host countries to put pressure on Azerbaijan. We haven't been very successful with that either, let's be honest. Okay, it hasn't resonated at that level. So this is kind of an issue that's very much in limbo. And so as far as Armenian society is concerned on this topic, it's becoming more of a prevalent issue than it was in February, to address your question. And as this drags on, I think it's going to become much more frustrating issue. And it's going to become a very important campaign issue as well. Well, with the elections coming up, this is going to keep coming up, and we're going to see what the parties that are competing are going to be able to address.
Karnig, I'm going to beg your indulgence because of what Professor said. I have a quick follow-up, very brief. Here's the follow-up. There's a lot of talk by a lot of, I thought I was progressive. I think I am. But there's a lot of talk by folks who apparently are far more progressive than I am, who think we should just, get along, kumbaya, talk to one another. And that, if Armenia is not directly talking to Turkey and directly talking to Azerbaijan, then Russia is talking for Armenia, and that's not good. I agree that when Russia and Turkey have spoken historically, it's never been good for Armenia, quite frankly. But what is your take as a political scientist? Do you think that we should be talking to Turkey and Azerbaijan, whose primary interest is to create the railroad and link the territories that they want to link, while they just hold on to our citizens, call them captives, call them prisoners. They don't want to call them prisoners of war because they don't want international guidelines to be applicable or kick in. Do you think that we can have a conversation with these two nations while they have committed the 21st century version of the Armenian genocide today?
We can have conversation at the diplomatic level through back channels because you always need to engage in that by virtue of the fact that you live next to each other. Now, whereas we're talking about whether you want to call it progressive or whatever, that whole discourse about societal discourse or civic society level discourse. At this stage, I'll be honest, that's an exercise in the nonsensical, because for the last 4 or 5 years, we're being taught at the broader level about preparing our populations for peace, right? This was pushed by the Minsk group, by the superpowers and everybody. And there was this whole artificial attempt by both societies to do it. We've got to be honest about something, okay? In Azerbaijan, the biggest consensus that society has is their hatred of an Armenian. Armenophobia is part of their political culture. So how do you have societal level discourse with a society that inherently views you as being subhuman? This is not a sustainable discourse. And so I agree with you that these discussions are really not honest. They're ideal. They would like for this to happen. But if you're reaching out and they chop your hand off, you don't reach out the other hand. This is why I said it's nonsensical. In principle, it sounds great, but the reality is different. So societal level, civic society reaching out at this stage, that's not tenable. I think a lot of people who are arguing for this are now realizing, by virtue of looking at a lot of these sort of peaceful civic society activists in Azerbaijan, and they're shocked at their level of warmongering and Armenophobia. So this is becoming something that's very clear. But as far as diplomatic back channeling discourse, discussions, that's necessary because there's just a lot of things that need to be resolved. So, these are two separate issues. But I agree with you in the sense that we cannot abdicate anything more than we've already given up by way of concessions, just for the hope that something good might come out of it.
Thank you.
And Professor, I think we see what comes out of it. I mean, we got an empty plane, right? And I think that there was political fallout. There will be political fallout from the fact that, I mean, there's plenty of evidence that people from the My Step Party had informed parents and informed the public that, in fact, there were going to, sons were going to be returned, or some were going to be returned. And when Muradov stepped off the plane by himself, I think it struck a chord, and really at the heart of what you said, that Armenophobia is fueled, the stamps that circulated of the exterminators, exterminators exterminating an area on the map, which is Artsakh. I think that that there's a disconnect, and I think that in some respects I feel as if it may be a generational disconnect where there are individuals that don't remember the first war, they don't remember the growth of essentially the animosity, and they don't really have a historical appreciation for what exactly is happening inside Azerbaijan with Armenophobia institutionalized in that way. But that kind of brings me back to the earlier question. Civic society may not have, or the general population may not have perceived Turkey as an existential threat, but they sure have perceived Azerbaijan as an existential threat, or they should have, which begs the question, that threat is not really gone. In fact, it's been delivered to the borders of Armenia, and we see that villager to villager, village to village. We see the predicament that the Armenians of Artsakh find themselves in at this moment. Yes, there might be physical security provided by the Russian troops, but as we study what's happening in Ukraine, the buildup of the signing of pacts between Turkey and Azerbaijan, the interest of Israel in the region, it's a very complicated neighborhood. And I don't think there are many people betting on the fact that the status quo is forever going to be a status quo. I don't think there's anyone that's betting on that. But I guess what I'm trying to get at, Professor, is there a lack, just generally speaking, whether it's within this government or within civic society generally, is there a lack of sophistication as to the regional geopolitics? I feel that many people were surprised by the sheer amount of interested players who were never part of the Armenian, let's say, political discourse, that were all of a sudden involved in a very substantive way in the war. Is there a lack of sophistication there? And if so, is that something that we need to develop a better understanding of in order to survive in the neighborhood?
I think we'll have that better understanding now, but just to honestly answer your question, it's not a question of sophistication. When for 30 years, your government tells you our army is infallible, that even if the Azeris try, right, we'll level them to the floor, we'll be having coffee in Baku, we'll destroy their oil fields, so on and so forth. When for 30 years, our government has given us a false sense of security, this is the byproduct of that. So civic society members, the average citizen, opposition or part of government, they're not well versed into the capabilities of the armed forces. So they took the government at its word when it gave us, all of us, whether they're or in the diaspora, a sense of security. And I think this is why no one viewed Azerbaijan as an existential threat. Okay? The second factor is that Azerbaijan's #1 priority is ethnic cleansing. They want to get rid of the region of Artsakh of Armenians. Okay? Now, let's be honest here. In the diaspora, this is a serious issue for us, both from an ideational and a moral lens, by virtue of our historical struggle and our drive for social justice. But we engaged in a lot of this similar behavior in the first Artsakh war. Not by design, but that was the byproduct, okay? Where, all the Azeris or Kurds, whoever lived in Kelbajar and so on and so forth, in Agdam, they just left because of the war, okay? Now, it wasn't pure ethnic cleansing by definition, but you had these people in the region, and they're no longer there after we won the war. And so exchange of populations isn't anything new. It's been going on for a couple of hundred years in the region. So to answer your question, in the diaspora, we're far more sensitive to that issue than a society in Armenia is, in the sense that we get very hysterical about it. But when we look at them, we're like, why aren't they freaking out? Because their perspective is a little different on that. So that kind of what explains it. But fundamentally, when you have a non-democracy until 2018 for so many years, we don't discuss national security because it's classified. It's a state secret. So we were clueless of all the flaws that we had. And then post-Velvet Revolution, right, this government was too afraid to tell us that our army is weak, our security architecture is almost non-existent, our system is basically deploted. They were too afraid to say that, right? It wasn't politically expedient. So when you look at the totality of it, this is the byproduct. So it's not a question of our citizens being lacking sophistication or civic society lacking this or that. It's that we've had a closed political system where lack of transparency, lack of information led to the situation that we have now. That's primarily that better explains our current approach to this issue. But I think this war changed a lot of that.
Yeah, I guess, just real quickly as a follow-up, Garo, I guess my concern is not so much, my question was not so much in terms of lack of sophistication of this, of civilians, as opposed to kind of an institutional, there was a lot of talk whether or not the war could have been diplomatically averted. And whether or not that was feasible or that it had been diverted for a number of years and now it wasn't. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a valid approach, I guess, from an international relations perspective? Was it predestined that this was going to happen? It was just a matter of time. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm sorry. This especially in light of the fact that supporters of the previous government, or you might want to call them the opponents of the current government, often say what you will, corruption, whatever, in the past, they didn't lose land, except for the 2016 four-day war. They say they didn't lose land, and look at this so-called, Velvet Revolution, Soros followers, whatever they call them.
Yeah, no, I'm from the school of thought that argues that this war was inevitable. I even wrote an article about this way before the war on the incoherence of peace. And the issue here is very, very straightforward. We have two sides whose positions are diametrically opposed. Both have maximalist positions, okay? And from the lens of international relations, whenever you have a disparity in the distribution of power, war becomes inevitable, okay? Azerbaijan has been spending between $2 to $3 billion a year for the last 10 years. What do we think they were spending that money on? They were going to use that inevitably. It was just a question of time. So as they got stronger, we remained stagnant. And so when the previous governments say, well, we didn't go to war, that's because through time, the power disparity increased. And the stronger that Azerbaijan got, the more maximalist it became. So whereas in the late 90s, in 97, 98, they would agree to certain terms, by 2010, those terms had changed. By 2016, those terms had changed, hence the 2016 war. And by 2018, their position was, you're going to give us whatever we want, and then we'll consider about the status of Artsakh, and we're not having conversations with you. You're never going to have a status that addresses with autonomy or anything else. So they take an extremely maximalist position. In response to that, Armenia naturally took a maximalist position. Well, when you don't meet in the middle, you can't have compromise. So it doesn't matter who sat with who. Either we're going to give these territories back without a war, or we're going to lose these territories through war because of the power disparity. It's really inconsistent with reality to suggest that a weaker party could negotiate on the same terms with the more powerful party. And because we had the illusion that there was a power disparity, we thought we could negotiate. But when this illusion was busted through the war, we had to be honest with ourselves. They knew they could beat us. So why would they negotiate with us on our terms? And I think that's why I never viewed the tenability of peace. Azerbaijan, for the longest time, Aliyev had promised a return of X, Y, and Z. And he was not going to get that through negotiations. And we have always said, we spilled blood for these territories. We're not going to give these territories back without spilling blood. So we always presupposed war as an only mechanism of giving what Azerbaijan wants. These maximalist positions were not going to lead to a compromise. That's why, as critical as I've been with the previous non-democratic governments, I've never criticized them for it on the negotiating table, because Baku's position has been untenable for Armenia, and it has become obscenely more obtainable through time. And this is why I think a compromise was never really a realistic situation. That's why the Minsk group pretty much quit on this, let's be honest. And I would kind of go back to Garo's point that there's an obvious element of intellectual dishonesty with proponents of the previous regime saying, well, we didn't lose territory or so on and so forth. Well, yeah, through the differentiation and power disparity, look what happened,
Professor, but do you agree that there's also a fundamental failure, an ongoing fundamental failure today with the current government's abilities or lack thereof to find a solution, whether it is with the Kremlin or certainly I have no hope in Europe, because when you speak, when I hear you talk about over time how the balance of power shifted, yes, I don't recall Aliyev 20 years ago talking about Zangezur or Yerevan being historic Azerbaijan. I don't recall him making any of these outrageous assertions or allegations. So today, when we have the Sunnik Mars in such serious security dilemma, and then I go back to that IRI poll, and I see that 42% of the people who participated in the poll said they're not going to vote for anybody. That's very, very disturbing, because it kind of alludes to the fact that people just don't think that anybody is capable. And when I say anybody, and I don't mean individual, I mean a collective, because what some of us need to remember, that whereas the current prime minister has 54% approval rating, individuals are not going to be running for parliament, correct? There's going to be parties or some groupings that are going to run for parliament. And when we talk about groupings, the My Step faction, if you will, according to that survey, has a 30% approval rating, despite the fact that the prime minister is at 54%. So how do you think the 42% came to that? Do you think that those 42% hail from the regions? Are they city folks? Because there's also disturbing news about people in Yerevan living like, nothing's wrong, life is going on. But then there are people who are living in barns, people from Hadrut, people from Shushi, homeless people. Artsakh is number 4 on our list, and I understand the difference between perspective, one who has lived all his or her life in Armenia versus diaspora, looking at Turkey differently. I understand all of that. What do you have to say about any of this?
Okay, so several different factors to consider here. The first factor I would say is the 54% approval of the prime minister is a better indicator than the 33% for a civil contract, because while you do vote for a party in parliamentary elections, Armenia's political culture is still heavily personalistic as opposed to being institutionalized. So in that context, when you ask people who are you voting for, no one's going to say civic contract. They're going to say Miko, or they're going to say, I don't know, Saro, whoever. Right. Yeah. So we don't have institutionalized parties yet. And so I think the individual is a better indicator of how their party will perform. The data, there's a lot of support for that data as exists. But I think more important than that, as you brought up, is that 42% that we speak of. Okay. I've never seen data like this where 42% say nobody. And it isn't, I don't know, right? In the US, the I don't know are the undecideds. These are not undecideds. They're simply saying no one. So 40% of Armenian society says we don't like anybody right now in the electoral field. that leads to a concept that we call voter alienation, which is a very, very dangerous thing for democracy, because voter alienation inevitably leads to apathy, and that becomes very, very dangerous. So we need to be very careful for this not to basically translate to apathy. That kind of suggests that there is room in the electoral field for new political forces, democratic political forces, to enter and to provide the people an alternative. So there's a lot of openings to have more competition in the political realm. With respect to the democratic breakdown of that 42%, or those basically that are not happy with this government, they are not rural. If you look at the support base for the prime minister of my step, it's heavily rural. He's very popular with the peasantry. He's very popular with the middle and lower middle classes. He's very popular with those who have only primary or vocational education. So that remains his base. Pashinyan's unpopularity is heavy in Yerevan. It's basically the educated upper middle class and upper class that's not happy with him. We can understand why the upper class isn't, because much of the upper class is connected to the previous regime. But you also have very sort of, young professionals who feel very disenfranchised or distraught by the inability of this government to meet a lot of the promises of the Velvet Revolution. And so that could be one important indicator, as the data shows. The data also suggests that a lot of single people are very unhappy with this government. And that's a very new finding that I picked up. Married people, older people, they're relatively giving the government a lot more leeway. But with single people, they seem to be some of the most disenfranchised electoral groups the data showed, who are really unhappy, and they make up a big chunk of that 42%, where they're like, there's no way we're going with the opposition because they're part of the authoritarian reserves and a remnant of the previous regime. And we lost trust in the competence of this government, so they go with no one. And so the solution to this is to have new democratic forces entering the electoral field. Non-democratic forces or those that are attached to the previous regime, they stand no chance even if they enter the electoral field, because the data really doesn't support them. We have about 17 of those parties in there. They poll at best 3%. So there isn't a market for them. They're marginalized. So you do need a new democratic forces to enter the electoral field. And I think they will do relatively well because there's a huge chunk that could be taken.
Professor Kopaylan, I just want to, for our audience, I know you're aware of this. For our audience, I want to mention, and if there's a comment worthy to be made by you, feel free. That poll that we keep referring to, and the 33%, or which is the civil contract party's approval rating. In fact, it's not even an approval rating. It's 33% said they would vote for the civil contract party. When you look at the next closest, it's prosperous Armenia at 3%. 3%. Yeah. And then it's mixed in with individualization of former President Robert Kocharyan is listed there at 2%. People have said, I'll vote for him. The Republican Party of Armenia, 1%. The ARF, Armenian Revolutionary Federation, as Armenia is concerned, I would have to clarify, 1%. The 17 parties, that notion of 17 parties, 1% of the people polled said, we'll vote for those 17 party collectives. Sasnat Zureh at 1%. And Bright Armenia is in parliament today. Active, quite active, I believe. By all accounts, it appears, at least tries to be. 1%. 1%. Yes, so there's a dire need based on this, to me, the non-political scientist, that there needs to be more engagement so that the 42% that is uninterested does not just remain uninterested. Professor, what the concern I have is, beyond remaining uninterested, doesn't look outside its borders, whether it's Russia, Europe, or elsewhere, United States or otherwise. There is a need. But this poll, and I encourage people, I believe, Karnig, you have put it on our on the messages under this Zoom live broadcast. I encourage people to look at it. People say that polls are not, are not reliable, are not trustworthy, are not this, are not that. But when you don't have legitimate or real underground information, polls serve a very useful purpose. I'm not going to speak to the credibility or lack of it as to this poll, but this poll seems to be, by all accounts, really echoing that which at least I have gleaned from my around-the-clock engagement with Homeland.
Few quick points. The IRA poll is not specific to Armenia. They do it throughout the world. It's U.S. funded. They just did a recent one in Georgia. They had one in Ukraine recently, in Kyrgyzstan. There was another one in Nigeria that I looked at. So their methodological techniques are very, very robust. I mean, you just look at the methodology for this survey. The sample size was 1,500. In the United States, if we get to 1,200, we're happy. The margin of error was about plus or minus 2.5%. That's very robust. So I didn't see any methodological deficiencies as a political scientist, as a methodologist from that lens. And then there's some questions, who's funding the poll? Is there a bias? Well, no, this is an international thing, a poll, right, that does it all over the world. They're going to do Ukraine and China. Armenia is not really seriously an issue for them to manipulate. So I don't have any concerns of reliability. But to get to your point in assessing the electoral field, the biggest disappointment from this data is Bright Armenia, because Bright Armenia was supposed to be the constructive democratic opposition. They're not tainted by being attached to the previous regime. They were part of the coalition with Pashinyan in the previous system. And so the collapse of Bright Armenia indicates an important trend. In Armenian politics, you don't criticize Pashinyan, okay? You could disagree with them, but let me rephrase myself. You don't attack Pashinyan. There's a very fascinating correlation between attacking Pashinyan and losing rating. The issue isn't that people love him so much they're going to stand by him. The data that I'm getting, the interpretation that I'm assessing here is that when Pashinyan is attacked, people automatically equate this attack with the previous government thing, the supporters, and therefore it declines. And it's not just Bright Armenia. What astonished me most in this poll was the drop in the rating of Armen Sarkisyan, the president. He went from 88% to 33% because he's perceived as somehow serving the interest of the non-velvet values. And I don't necessarily think that's the case, but I think we're kind of seeing data here that suggests if you attack Pashinyan, you're going to hurt yourself. You might hurt him a little, but you're going to hurt yourself more. And this is what we primarily saw with Bright Armenia, who went from basically in the 7-8 percentile to less than 1%. So I think that's a very, very sad development from the lens of electoral competition. Also, Bright Armenia lost a couple of very important people. They lost Arman Babacanyan, who's a very popular independent politician, and they lost Mane Tandilyan, who's a prolific consensus builder and very independent thinker, and is sort of a model for a female politician in Armenia. And I think those dynamics played their loss. But all the other parties that they fall into the authoritarian reserve discourse. People know Prosperous Armenia is basically a front for thing, Ghazarian. Everybody knows that. There's no trust in that. There's no trust in Kocharyan. Everybody knows what the Republican Party is. The more concerning development here has been a diminishing approval of the Darshanktitsun. The RF is a storied party that is very relevant in the diaspora. But in Armenia, by virtue of aligning themselves with the previous regimes and thus falling into the authoritarian trap, they have been electorally marginalized and they're not able to perform electorally. And the recent talks about them forming a faction with Kocharyan in the next elections is further going to diminish their standing as far as electoral performance is concerned in Armenia. So, the third party, that's why I noted initially, any new third force that comes that tries to take that 42%, has to be democratic and it has to be constructive. People are tired of attacking dirty politics. We need a change. We need to elevate the narrative. And I think that's what that 40% is waiting for.
Professor, we have a little bit of time left. I just want to wrap up with probably a couple questions, and I'm sure Garo's got one as well. You mentioned Mane Tandilyan, who's now in Stepanakert. So let's go back, if you will, to the Artsakh question as to where we are today from a regional politics issue, and perhaps even from how does, at this stage, perhaps through the election, how does Pashinyan play the Artsakh situation? What do we see happening in a very real sense in Artsakh? Now, I mean, here we are, nearly approximately half a year, right? Since we're at 5 months perhaps exactly right now. What is the reality that either people, as you mentioned earlier, from a post-traumatic position, don't want to deal with, or because of the amount of players that are involved in the strong Russian position, may feel that it's, I don't even want to put words in your mouth. What do you see is the reality on the ground, the reality for the Artsakh Armenian, and more importantly, perhaps, what is the role of Armenia in Artsakh in the next 5 years? What role does it actually play now? In the beginning, we understood it as the protector of the Artsakh Armenians. It's clearly not from a physical standpoint. And a lot, may depend on what kind of resources will be marshaled diplomatically. I don't know. What are the realities?
Official Yerevan's position in Artsakh has immensely diminished. There's no denying that. There's sort of this, reigning open secret, humor, if you will, that's floating around that, Artsakh belongs to Muradov, the head of the Russian peacekeepers right now. He basically runs Artsakh. That's the prevailing discourse. And pretty much anything that happens is pretty much run through him. So official Yerevan's position as far as physical security is no longer there. The only or the major role that it has is basically human capital, intellectual resources, strategic planning resources for growth, development, infrastructure, and economic assistance. The next 5 years, that is all Yerevan could do with respect to Artsakh. It cannot send armaments because Russia controls the borders. We don't even control the borders anymore. So in that context, Artsakh for the next 5 years is going to remain within the purview of how Russia's peacekeeping administration grows and develops and runs Artsakh. That's just the honest truth. Of course, there is some give and take there from time to time, but fundamentally, that is the reality. Now, I'm not convinced that Russia is going to live in 5 years. Matter of fact, I don't see Russia living for some time. Because if you see Russia's behavior in Artsakh, they're not behaving like peacekeepers. They have a lot more than 2,000 troops. You got to be honest about that. They're building hospitals. They're building infrastructure. They're building hospitals. They're not engaging in behavior that suggests a 5 or 10 year stay. So there's a lot of dynamics there that is already making Baku uncomfortable, but that's a different subject of discourse for a different time. But from Yerevan's perspective, all Armenia could do right now is to rebuild and reform its army to potentially be able to defend Artsakh robustly and not simply through narrative. So that is our honest reality right now. We gotta deal with that. So that's where I see this going. The current government, its position is going to be heavily economic. They're going to talk about economic growth in Artsakh, sort of, developing infrastructure there, human capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't do anything about security because security falls within the purview of the Russians right now.
And to follow up with that, Professor, aren't we in a very peculiar predicament here? Because even given the fact that OSCE is not really actively engaged, although they made a couple of sputtering attempts to try to get back in the game, we're left with a very unique situation where for the time that Armenia was the protector, Armenia was also the voice at the table when we went from a 3-party format to a 2-party format. Now, there is no Armenian voice at the table potentially at all. Or is it going to be a forced Armenian participation? When I say forced, It's just, let's fill the seat in the room with an Armenian representative, even though they have no, the Yerevan, official Yerevan has no military control over the situation, has no, perhaps, I don't know, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong. Is there a chance for a larger void here where the Armenians of Artsakh don't have a patron, an Armenian patron, whether it's their own government or whether it's Yerevan, to speak for their interests in any negotiation, quite frankly?
Karnig, you're assuming there's going to be a negotiation or a table to sit on, because Aliyev keeps saying the Karabakh issue is resolved. So from his lens, what is he going to sit and resolve if he considers the issue resolved in of itself? And that's why that posturing that he's taken is kind of bringing out all these questions that what's going to happen with the Karabakh issue, because right now no one is talking about the Artsakh issue. We're talking about railroads, opening economic channels, return of POWs, the link from Syunik into Nakhichevan, and then of course Aliyev trying to interject nonsense of discourse on a corridor, which is untenable. The issue of Karabakh status is not even on the table, because one party saying there's nothing to talk about, I resolved it, while the other party saying nothing is resolved. So at this stage, I don't see a discussion or a platform as far as the immediate future is concerned. But dynamics could play a very, very different role as things develop. Potentially, I do see some animosity arising between Russia and Azerbaijan by virtue of continued Russian presence in the internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan, in Artsakh. And so if these things intensify, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians decide, you know what? Artsakh is part of the problem, they're part of the conflict, maybe they should have a representative. It's possible that Russia can be used as a conduit to have Stepan Akert sit at the table down the line if Aliyev keeps pushing Kremlin's buttons, for example. So these are possible tenabilities down the line. But at this point, we're not having any discussions about the status of Artsakh as what's going to happen. And Minsk has already conceded that this is a Russia issue. Even the U.S. State Department, when questions were posed about the POW situation, they said, this is a Russian problem. So I think the world has conceded the fact that Russia was able to stop the conflict. It's Russia's backyard. They will find some mechanism of not solving, but basically addressing the conflict. So I don't see Minsk being relevant at any point, at least in the next 5 to 10 years. Wow. But to answer your question, what we had prior to the war of the parties sitting and discussing, Aliyev's position is, I solved the conflict through force. I have nothing to talk to you about. And that's potentially going to be another set of issues to address.
It is very, very, very disheartening to hear you analyze as you did, Professor. For years, I and many others have spoken about the need for Artsakh to be represented at the table. I will never understand how, I believe it's in Bishkek in '94, when there was a peace treaty or a ceasefire, I suppose rather, Artsakh was at the table. This is going to sound perhaps harsh. The government in Armenia, in Yerevan, as far as I'm concerned, failed the people of Artsakh, we cannot talk about one nation, two states, and leave our compatriots surrounded, ruled, as I am gleaning from your analysis, ruled by Russians, bless the Russians, but ruled by Russians. They don't have a say-so. I had previously suggested that, if Armenia cannot speak, if Armenia is the only one that's supposed to speak for Artsakh, and Armenia is unable to, or is failing at speaking for Artsakh, then perhaps Artsakh should be able to speak directly to Russia. And I imagine Artsakh speaks with Russia because they have Russian troops in Artsakh. But really speak, but of course, it goes back to the inequities, and it goes back to the imbalance of power, military might. How are you supposed to speak to someone if you're not speaking from a position of strength? To the extent that that strength can be mustered up with the diaspora, with Armenia, focused a little bit more about Artsakh and all things Artsakh instead of economy. That economy that everybody thinks is going to save the day is going to cost us further homeland territories, Armenia homeland territories, in my amateur opinion. So with all of this in the background, and yes, I get it, if people are attacking the prime minister, they're going to lose votes or face, if you will. Do you think that there could be, you just came from there, do you think that there could be a collective that will rise, that will at least perhaps replace the now apparently inefficient Bright Armenia Party as a viable opposition? Because I'm getting the sense, and I won't reveal my sense, I'll just ask you my final question. How do you think the election will turn out in Yerevan in light of these sentiments?
So there are a lot of hints that at least 2 or 3 relatively serious political forces will be entering the electoral field. There's talks by Arman Babajanyan, who was from Bright Armenia, now is independent. He has his own party. He will participate, so that is sort of he's more reformist, center-left. He will get quite a bit of votes, and I think he will make it into parliament. There are talks by David Sanasaryan, very big activist during the Velvet Revolution. Yes. Had a bit of a fallout by virtue of the shenanigans of Arthur Vanetian, so on and so forth. We're not going to get into that. He's forming a political party. So you are seeing sort of a healthy chunk of the activists during the Velvet Revolution who were very good at mobilizing and who, through the last 3 years, have not found their place with the current government, but they're still able to fill a void, getting ready to immerse themselves in the political field. And if these new parties are able to get, past the 5% threshold, 7% here, 10% there, 9% there, then you could have a healthy, democratic, constructive opposition that could work with what could be potentially a 50 to 55% majority for the Pashtun government to advance a more democratic or reform-minded agenda. That's kind of where I see the elections going. Would prosperous Armenia party be able to sneak in past the 5%? It's possible, but Ghazarian didn't do any favors for himself by throwing that party that he did for his son yesterday and kind of created all this public relations nightmare for him through this tone deafness. Could Kocherov potentially pass that 5% threshold? It's possible. He has a lot of resources, but those are minimal things we're talking about. So if we could get sort of 3 or 4 democratic parties that are surpassing the threshold and entering parliament, then we could have a more balanced parliament. Because having a parliament dominated 70% by a party, regardless how victorious that party was after the Velvet Revolution, regardless how legitimate Democrat that party was, it's problematic for democratic politics because you don't have competition. So I'm hoping for a more competitive parliament, a more consensus-driven parliament in the next elections. And I think we're going to see that because if you're not getting 70%, that remaining 30, 35, 40% has to be filled up. And whatever fills that up is going to lead to more dynamics and pluralism.
Professor, thank you very much for your time today. I have a feeling that we could probably discuss for hours more because just the sheer breadth of your experience and analysis is enlightening and really helped us get to the bottom of some really, from the diasporan lens, some issues that are really difficult to swallow in some cases, and perhaps even more difficult to understand. So we do appreciate very much your empirical analytical approach to really getting underneath numbers, underneath political trends and realities, and also for a very honest yet sobering analysis of what our compatriots in Artsakh are looking at the current moment. And so we again thank you very much. We do hope that we're going to have an opportunity to chat with you again as the weeks move forward, as we get closer to June 20th, as developments continue on the ground with the hostage situation, as well as with really geopolitical changes that are happening, as we know in the last 48 hours, just increased forces on the Ukraine front, if you will, and what that means, if anything, for Armenia and for Artsakh as well. So there's a lot we didn't get enough into geopolitics, but I know that that's an area that you have quite a breadth of knowledge in as well, and hopefully we'll have that opportunity again. I want to kick it over to Garo for last closing words before we sign off.
Thank you, Karnig. First, let me say I'm extremely grateful for you having joined us, and yes, we're going to ask you to join us again, because there are so many things that I did not get to, and there are so many things that are going to come up that we're going to want to get to with you for your perspective. It's the Sunday after Easter, if I'm not mistaken, for us here in the US. It's also 152 days after active warfare stopped in Artsakh. 152 days. That's 5 months. What has happened in the last 5 months is very disturbing on many levels, both on the streets of Yerevan with the finger-pointing internal bickering, and I'm sad to say also in parts of the diaspora with internal bickering, differences of opinion, pro-Pashinyan, anti-Pashinyan, pro-government, anti-government, people within their own family having differences of opinion, people within political parties having differences of opinion. There is no time to waste. And it was made clear to me today when I attended a memorial service of a dear beloved uncle-in-law who passed away a year ago during COVID. As I stood there and I heard his son-in-law speak, his friend from childhood speak, they spoke about this man's love of his people. They spoke about the man's love of Armenia. And I felt just a slight sense of relief that he was not around to witness what occurred in Artsakh, and to witness how we dealt with it after the war, we among ourselves internally, whether it's homeland or diaspora. And the 42% that don't want to vote for anybody is a gift compared to the perhaps 92% of the Armenians in the diaspora who are Armenians at parties, at restaurants, who are Armenians when they want to go and have tourism and activities to relax in Armenia. We need to be a lot more than that. And with June 20th coming up, people say, you know, elections don't mean anything. I beg to differ. Engagement means everything. And when you engage, at least those who seek election will know that someone is going to hold them accountable, whether it is in the homeland, whether it is the people of Artsakh who have a right to hold all of us accountable, or whether it is the people of the diaspora who live and breathe and lose sleep over all things Armenia, Artsakh, and Armenians. It is the likes of you, Professor, who take time away from the comfort of your daily life and the safety that comes with it, and go and put yourself out there and stick your neck out. You are a prime example that we each can contribute in our own different way, and the sacrifices we make along the way pale in comparison to the ultimate sacrifices made by all those who have fallen during the 44-day war we call it, but the 44-day battle of existence for our survival. We need one another, and we need to stop bickering with one another, and we need to have more dialogue instead of more discontentment with one another. Professor, keep the good work. We will try and follow suit, and we will meet again often off the air and as well as on the air. Thank you for being with us.
I'm immensely grateful for you having me on the program, and I'll be more than happy to return.
Thank you. If those are your final words, thank you. If you have any final parting remarks, please go ahead. We will sign off right after you say anything.
I'll just add on to what you and Karnig said. Listen, our collective hearts were broken. Okay, but with heartbreak comes rebuilding, comes re-strengthening, and we don't have the time to feel sorry for ourselves as a nation, and we don't have the time to bicker, as you said. There's important work to be done, and we could address and resolve our issues and then look back and blame each other. But at this time, I don't think we have the luxury to do that. And so the hard work lays ahead, and I think we're obviously much better off addressing those complexities than anything else at this point.
Wonderful words to end on, Professor. Thank you very much again for joining us, and good night to you.
Yeah, thank you.